Okay, the first question's here. Well, the best, okay, so we focused on whether or not to provide a prompt. So the most effective, and remember there's only 37 people in this study. So the most effective was early in the study, if you got a prompt and you were at home or work, and that was the most, it didn't matter the content of the prompt. Oh, I have to tell you though, okay, so when you're working in mobile health, sometimes the sensors mess up. For example, you know this if you use the Google Maps facility, because the blue dot has you in the water and you're not in the water, right? And when you're doing, so the content of these interventions was informed by their sensor data. There were times at which the sensor data was incorrect. But the tailoring was so, at the times the sensor data was correct, the tailoring was very good. So what happened was the participants began to get very high expectations for the ability to implement whatever the suggestion was. So when the sensor data was poor, for whatever reason, it really aggravated them a lot. So in focus groups after this study, this was a big comment. And so what we need to do in future is we have to have a way to let the user know that the mobile app is still learning, and every now and then it will mess up and give you a message that might not be well tailored to your setting. It's just because it's still learning and getting things straight. We need to manage the expectations of the user. That was a big issue in this problem. It didn't happen that much, but when it did, it really aggravated the user. Okay, the next question. I'm totally cool. So the speaker, I was asked what kinds of engagement strategies might one use to maintain engagement? Should it involve rewards? Sarah, right here, it's all about engagement. So this is a study with a lot of micro-randomization. These are with adolescents and young adults. They're having problems with alcohol. They're recruited out of an emergency room, so they're really having problems. And we want to understand their perceived loneliness, so we can't sense it. We wanted to understand their perceived stress, not their physiological stress, their perceived stress. So we needed to ask them. And so here we have a game that's it's gamified. So if you answered questions, you got points in the game. In this particular game, you grew an aquarium. The aquarium's quite cool, actually, because when you get a new fish, you find out really interesting facts about a fish. It turns out octopus have blue blood, incidentally, and all kinds of things about these fish. It was very interesting, and you leveled up. You could go to the aquarium and build a fish in an aquarium, and then there was a lot of other engagement strategies that were more behaviorally based, which is, I think, what you were indicating. So one randomization was whether or not we give you a present for no reason at all during the day. Would you then reciprocate to us and answer our question later in the day? And the present here is inspirational quote or a lyric from an age-appropriate popular star, none of whom I recognized. I wish I could remember the name of that one of the. But anyway, I can't even remember their names. And then we also had, if you answered the questions we asked you, you could get a reinforcer. So we randomized whether or not you'd get a reinforcer and the kinds of reinforcers to understand what kinds of reinforcers might be most conducive towards you continuing to be engaged enough to answer our questions. So and the reason why we're doing that here is the real purpose of this app. It's going to have multiple studies, is so that we can help these kids, right? That is the real reason. But it's very hard to keep adolescents engaged in a mobile health intervention. So we thought, let's start with the hardest problem of all. We just want to collect data from them. That's not helping them at all. How can we design an app that has enough engagement strategies so that they will provide information for us? In another study, we're using a lot of marketing, behavioral economics to attempt to provide engagement strategies. This actually, in my opinion, this is the biggest problem in mobile health right now, is how do you maintain engagement? And when we go, so one of our goals now, I'm going to talk to the computer scientists, is to produce what we call policies for how we'll provide these interventions that are personalized to the individual. And there'll be a policy both for engagement as well as therapeutics. And they'll have to work together. So it's like a hierarchical policy. That's the future here. But engagement is, like your question is like so on. It is primary. It's front and center. If you don't deal with this, it's over. Oh, I see. Yes. Okay. So in the bariatric study, in this study, at the begin, there were a baseline randomization, and a lot of this was about every day you would get a goal for how many steps you would attempt to go for, and that goal was set on how well you were performing in the past. So it was intended to, once you got to a certain level, to help you increase that level. Of course, as long as it wasn't adverse for your health. But certainly that's a big issue here. And so what we really want is there to be long-term positive effects of these interventions. That is, I start to develop new habits. Now we're talking about positive habituation, not negative habituation. I start developing new habits. Like in the mid-morning, I always take a walk now, whereas before I might not have. That sort of thing. And here, with the goal setting, it was to slowly but surely increase my activity. And then to, in this particular case, it was also to produce some variety in my goals as well. That is known in psychology. These are intermittent reinforcement schedules, and that's known to reduce the rate of negative habituation. So there was a lot of theory that went into that study, the Bariatric Study. Yeah, they were really cute, the little questions, because it's all human-computer interaction. So the questions had little faces, and you would feel, you just ticked the face that reflected. Yeah, a little, and there were only a few questions. I can't remember, maybe 6 in the evening. It was every evening. In the focus groups after the study, we did focus groups in the exit interviews, and the participants complained a good bit about having to answer those questions every evening. So in the new study, the study that's going to go into the field, they're only being asked to answer questions weekly. However, we have another study, which I can't show you the schematic for, and it's all about how do we reduce the burden. So there's always going to be settings where we have to ask for self-report because we want your perceptions. And so first we can try and increase engagement, like I spoke about earlier, but we can also try and reduce the burden. And so in this particular study, each person had a little wristband, and we wanted them to answer their perceptions multiple times per day, but we didn't want to bother them. So what we did was the wristband would vibrate at that time, and it would say, a little message would come up, and it'd say, remember the moment. That's all it would say. And then in the evening, we would reflect for the 15 minutes before and after. We showed them on a map where they walked, where they moved. We reflected back their ambient noise, whether there was a lot of people speaking around them. I can't remember something else. And the idea was, would they be more likely to answer that question? Would they do a good job, accurately answer the question about that time, remember the moment? In the evening, they were given contextual information to help them remember their answer to that question. And would they be more likely to respond? And we saw definitely they were more likely to respond. And we haven't finished the analyses, so I can't tell you, or I can't remember, which is even more likely, whether or not we got good accuracy, the accuracy level. But certainly, there's two sides to the engagement story. Reducing burden, increasing engagement. And you want to go for both. No, I actually find that people, they just don't care. You know, that's the simple fact. I mean, I think the only people that really care are the scientists. So we went to a lot of trouble, like we encrypt all the information. I was a consultant on a study that was for people who were recovering from cocaine use, and there we went to a lot of trouble as soon as they answered the question to transmit the questions to the cloud, encrypted ASAP, immediately, because if that person got arrested by the police, we didn't want the answers to the questions to get the person in trouble. We were so much more concerned about the user's privacy than the user was. That's been my experience so far, is that everybody now is so embedded. They have so many people, they're being tracked continuously. No, you have to realize people sign up for these studies, right? So there could very well be some selection bias in the sense that someone who's, wants to put aluminum foil on top of their, for a long time my sister had tape over the camera on her computer. Right? This is actually not such a bad idea to put tape there, you know what I mean? Because if your computer gets hijacked, they can watch you. But the people who sign up for these, they're clearly not concerned about this. And we do go out of our way to keep everything encrypted because most of the time, these are clinical people that have real problems. Well, originally we did in fact want to have the decision points every minute because we were concerned that we would miss minutes. But once we saw this data, it was so, now of course everybody in this study had a regular, a daytime job. This is really important to realize. With in-person variance really peaks around those 5 times. So why send them messages at times that they're probably stuck sitting at their desk and there's nothing we can do? We really wanted to target those times. But like in Sense to Stop, one of those studies that was at the very beginning, oh no, I think I have it in here, yeah. In this study, we are going every single minute. We look, we see there's a classifier about whether or not you're physiologically stressed, and it can, at any given minute, we could attempt to provide support to help you manage your stress. The timing for the decision points is related really to in this case, how frequently we could get a classification of stress. We could only get a classification of stress at the minute level, so that's the timing we used. In hard steps, it was because once we could get a classification every minute, so we could have gone that route, but the data indicated that people didn't have a lot of variance in their life in terms of activity at other times, so it just wasn't worth it. We didn't want to waste our intervention. We wanted to increase the power. And by having accidentally providing treatment at times at which it was just not possible for them to respond, we'd have wasted power. So a lot of these are funded by the National Institutes of Health, which is the state's version. So the speaker asked me, did we have problems publishing these papers? Did we have problems? And I'm also going to answer the question, did we have problems funding these studies, which is really what most people are interested in initially. What we're finding is right now, in the health science community, there's this enormous desire to unpack our interventions, to really understand what components are working and what are not. And so there's enormous discontent with the standard approach of completely forming an intervention. Of course, it's based on scientific expertise, reviews of the literature, and so on, and then comparing that package versus a control in a randomized trial, because that trial wasn't intended to really understand the science, to further develop science. If you get a failed experiment, you're sort of dead in the water. So, in fact, what we're finding is the enthusiasm is overwhelming for this. Now, there is an extra, like when you write a grant, you have to make an additional effort to write with great clarity. You have to address concerns of the reviewers proactively, because these are very new kinds of things. However, and the same goes for papers as well. But our experience has been incredibly positive. In fact, we're having a little bit of trouble. For example, NIH has had a number of calls, not for this study, but for another type of design that we had that was also about sequential experimentation, multiple randomizations per person. And NIH releases these calls where they ask people to apply for grants. And then they'll have a whole bunch of ideas about what they want the grants on. And we got a whole host of calls that actually requested these types of experimental designs. But I remember in particular one call, it was absolutely clear to me that that design was inappropriate for that scientific problem. So in fact, there's been a little too much excitement. So I do, like, people email me about they want to run studies like this, and I usually have a phone call with them, because often I end up telling them, oh no, I think you should do a 2-arm randomized trial instead, or maybe a focus group or qualitative study or some other kind of study. But so in fact, we've gotten a little bit too much excitement, but we are trying to really, we don't want to run around with our hammer and hammer everything. Right. So there's a lot of concern about this. There's another study, not this Sense to Stop, but the same group is doing another study. I'm not involved as closely. It's not at the stage yet where I'm going to be involved. But this is about fluid in the lungs. And it's to prevent heart failure. And there we have wearables that monitor the fluid in the lungs. And the idea is that we want to develop an app which, if the fluid increases but not too bad, we might have messages about salt intake, because salt is a big issue when you're concerned about increasing fluid in the lungs. But we also will have to have alerts that if the fluid in the lungs gets to a certain point, maybe you have to contact the partner or the healthcare system. So you can imagine a whole graded scale at which, do you contact the participant? Do you contact a partner, someone they've designated? Do you contact the clinical staff? Now, most of my work, and I am very interested in that. Right now, though, most of my work, I have preferred to focus on helping people help themselves. A lot of people don't like the idea of that some clinician might be contacted. That's very off-putting. So right now, I've pretty much focused on helping people help themselves. That said, I have a collaboration with someone at Flinders University, and this is with people with mental illness and suicide prevention. And there definitely will have to be some system for providing alerts if things appear to be getting too bad. The question is, how do you make it in a gradated way so that you don't turn off the person? Because you can imagine that if you notify clinical staff too early, you get these false positives, that person may delete that app. You've got to give people, think of self-determination theory. You have to allow them freedom. You can't, So I think these issues are really important, and they're very nuanced. Right, that's great. That's a good reason why they're unavailable, right? I mean, this is great. So the last Heart Step study is going to be for a year. So that's long-term in the world of mobile health. And there we're going to be running multiple online reinforcement learning algorithms. But the thing is, so we want the algorithm to back off when you're doing well, and then to be there, though, to maintain enough engagement so that you you don't delete the app, so that if you start to slip up, say for example, your child gets sick and you're not able to be active for a while, this is exactly when people slip up with physical activity. The weather changes, the school pattern, something happens in their life, they slip back and they think, oh, I'm going to go back, and they don't. So we want to have the algorithm back off when it should, and then come back when it shouldn't. And also, these are in the world of statistics and computer science, these are highly non-stationary settings because people are changing over time. So the algorithm, there always has to be a low level of experimentation. It could be that providing a message in a certain context doesn't help you earlier in the intervention, but later in the intervention, if you provide that message in that context, it will help you. So there has to be always some low probability that you might get it in that context, just so that we'll know that we have to, now it's useful to do it, whereas before it wasn't. So certainly for that year-long study, that's our plan. Now, this next study is just 3 months, so we're going to be trialing several algorithms of this type. I'm a wreck, actually, because, you know, I'm so scared. I mean, these are non-trivial, as you can imagine. But we'll run a couple of people for like 3 or 4 weeks, and then we'll go into the full 3 months, and we'll see what mess we have. We'll clean that up, and then we'll go to the year-long study. Because, you know, now you have algorithms of all kinds running on the devices. Yeah. But I'm totally with you. Maintenance of behavior change, in my opinion, is the big goal here. And we're working also, I don't know if you know this guy, Alex Rothman, that's his area. Some of the interventions in the next version are from him. And we're micro-randomizing because he has certain ideas about which ones would work better for maintenance. So it's quite exciting. Yeah. Yeah, so here, so it depends on what we're using. So I was asked, how do you validate the models in this type of a setting? So it depends on what the models are being used for. If the model is being used to predict risk, for example, or relapse, then you can always look ahead. You update the model every time you get the event. And you will, in the last year-long study, we're going to actually pool over people in real time. So you predict, and you see whether or not it happens. You update. You predict, you see whether or not it happens. Yeah, there's like these look-ahead type. That's your label, your outcome. In the sequential decision-making setting, which is which treatment to provide in which context, we have several ideas. So like after the study's over, we want to see whether or not the randomization probabilities, they'll be evolving with time, and they'll become higher if we think you'll be more responsive, and lower if we think you'll be less responsive, the randomization to treatment. So we want to see, does in us, an analysis after the study is over, does that randomization probability, does it interact with the treatment? Because it's acting as, it's our best guess whether or not the treatment is useful in that context. The higher the randomization probability is, our guess is that it's going to work well in that context. The lower the randomization probability is, our guess is that it won't work well in that context. Now, these probabilities are bounded away from 0 and 1, so we can always test. That's critical here, okay? Otherwise, you get collinearity. But so we have a variety of ways. So with the sequential decision making, any kind of validation, it's not structural validation. It's whether or not we're actually predicting whether or not the treatment, are our predictions that the treatment will be more effective, are they holding up?